Have you ever felt that invisible weight pressing on your chest when you wake up? That voice whispering that everything could go wrong today? You're not alone in this battle. There's something about fear that goes beyond simple worry. It becomes a prison that keeps you from experiencing the fullness that God has prepared for your life. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this reality intimately, and what she discovered about releasing fear might completely transform how you understand divine trust. You wake up each morning carrying burdens that weren't meant for your shoulders. The fear of failure, of not being enough, of losing what you love, of facing an uncertain future. These fears don't just disturb your peace, they build walls between you and the Holy Spirit's action in your life. When fear dominates, you automatically take control, trying to manage every detail, predict every outcome, control every variable. But what if this very attempt to control is what's blocking the divine intervention you so desperately need? Saint Teresa understood this spiritual dynamic with crystal clarity. In her Way of Perfection, she wrote, "Let nothing trouble you, let nothing frighten you. All things pass away, God never changes." But she didn't write these words from a place of ease. She wrote them from the depths of her own struggles with fear and the need for control. She discovered that fear is not just an emotion. It's a spiritual condition that closes the door to the Lord who comes to work wonders in the soul. The Holy Spirit cannot take full control of a life that insists on maintaining control. It's like trying to steer a car while someone else grips the wheel. There will be conflict, confusion, and ultimately, you won't reach your destination. But when you learn to release your grip, when you choose trust over fear, something extraordinary happens. The same Spirit that moved over the waters at creation begins to move over the chaos of your life, bringing order, peace, and purpose you never imagined possible. Are you ready to discover what it means to truly let go? Tonight, as silence settles around you, can you hear it? That constant mental noise of planning, worrying, calculating every possible scenario. This is what Saint Teresa called the dark night of human control, when the soul becomes so accustomed to self-reliance that it forgets how to rest in divine providence. You've been carrying responsibilities that were never meant to be yours, trying to be the author of your own story when you were created to be a character in God's magnificent narrative. The Catholic Church teaches us that fear, when it's not the gift of prudence, becomes an obstacle to grace. CCC 1817-1821. But understanding this intellectually and living it are two completely different things. You know you should trust God, you've heard it countless times. Yet when crisis hits, when uncertainty looms, when the future becomes unclear, you instinctively grab for control. This isn't because you're weak, it's because you're human, and humans were designed to need something greater than themselves. Saint Teresa experienced this tension profoundly. In her autobiography, she describes periods when she tried to manage her spiritual life through her own efforts, planning her prayers, controlling her experiences with God, measuring her progress like a business project. But she discovered something revolutionary. The more she tried to control, the further she drifted from authentic divine union. The soul that trusts little, she wrote, receives little, not because God gives little, but because it opens little space for receiving. This is the paradox that might be keeping you trapped right now. Your fear of losing control is precisely what's preventing you from experiencing the abundant life Christ promised. When you hold tightly to the steering wheel of your life, you're actually choosing the illusion of security over the reality of divine protection. But what if tonight, in the quiet of your heart, you began to practice a different way? What if you started to see your fears not as warnings to take more control, but as invitations to surrender more deeply? In a small, cold cell in the convent of the Incarnation, Saint Teresa knelt in prayer one winter night when everything in her life seemed to be falling apart. The monastery was in debt, the community was divided, and she felt completely inadequate for the reform God was calling her to undertake. But instead of making more plans or seeking more advice, she did something that would revolutionize not only her life, but the entire Carmelite order. She surrendered completely. "Let it be whatever God wills," she whispered, "because He knows better what suits us." This wasn't a passive resignation or spiritual laziness. This was what the Church calls filial abandonment, the conscious choice to trust in God's fatherly providence, even when circumstances suggest He's absent or uncaring. Saint Teresa discovered that surrender isn't about giving up your will. It's about aligning your will with the divine will, which always seeks your highest good. She learned that when she stopped trying to be God in her own life, she finally had space to let God be God. From that night forward, Teresa noticed something extraordinary happening. Doors opened that had been closed for years. People appeared who could help with the monastery's problems. Solutions emerged that she could never have devised on her own. But most importantly, she experienced a peace that didn't depend on external circumstances, a peace that comes only when the soul rests in divine hands. The soul that has learned to trust, she wrote to her nuns, walks without fear even in the darkest valleys. But here's what Teresa discovered that might shock you. This surrender wasn't a one-time decision. It was a daily, moment-by-moment choice. Every morning she had to choose again to trust rather than control. Every challenge required a fresh act of abandonment. Every fear demanded a new declaration of faith. This is why she insisted that spiritual life isn't about achieving some perfect state of trust, but about practicing trust until it becomes as natural as breathing. Are you ready to begin this practice today? Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss more teachings and advice from Saint Teresa. You've probably tried to pray your fears away, listing them before God like a worried child presenting problems to a parent. But Saint Teresa discovered a completely different kind of prayer, one that doesn't ask God to remove the circumstances that cause fear, but asks for grace to trust completely, regardless of what happens. This is the prayer of radical abandonment, and it has the power to transform not just your spiritual life, but every aspect of your existence. In her Interior Castle, Teresa describes this prayer as entering a room in the soul where human reasoning cannot enter, a space where only faith, hope, and love can operate. Here, she learned to pray, "Lord, I don't ask you to change my circumstances. I ask you to help me trust you completely in the midst of them." This shift from petition to surrender marked the beginning of her deepest mystical experiences because it created space for the Holy Spirit to work without human interference. The Church teaches that this kind of prayer opens us to the gifts of the Holy Spirit. CCC 1830-1832. When you pray for trust rather than for specific outcomes, you're essentially telling God, "I trust your wisdom more than my own understanding. I trust your love more than my own plans. I trust your timing more than my own urgency." This prayer doesn't require special words or perfect conditions. It only requires the honest intention to mean what you're saying. Teresa practiced this prayer especially during her most difficult moments. When facing opposition to her reforms, when suffering from illness, when enduring spiritual dryness, she would repeat, "May whatever God wills be done, for He knows what is best for us." But she warned that this prayer demands genuine interior conversion. You can't pray for surrender while your heart still clings to control. The prayer itself becomes the process of letting go, word by word, breath by breath, until your soul finally relaxes into divine arms that were always there, waiting to catch you. Have you ever noticed those moments when you knew exactly what to do without knowing how you knew? When words came to you that weren't quite your own? When you found strength in situations where you should have been overwhelmed? These aren't coincidences. They're the Holy Spirit operating through His 7 gifts, and Saint Teresa understood this better than perhaps any saint in church history. She lived in such harmony with these gifts that her life became a transparent channel for divine action. The Church identifies 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit: wisdom, understanding, counsel, fortitude, knowledge, piety, and fear of the Lord, CCC 1830-1831. But Teresa discovered that these gifts only operate freely in souls that have learned to step aside and let God work. When fear dominates, when you insist on controlling outcomes, when you trust only in your own understanding, you're essentially blocking the very assistance heaven wants to provide. It's like having the world's best GPS system but refusing to follow its directions. Teresa experienced this most clearly during her work of reform. She often found herself in impossible situations, founding monasteries without money, convincing authorities who opposed her, managing conflicts that seemed insurmountable. But she noticed that when she approached these challenges from a place of surrender rather than anxiety, solutions appeared that were far superior to anything she could have devised. The Holy Spirit, she wrote, is the best administrator of our affairs when we have the humility to let him work. This is where your transformation begins, in learning to recognize and follow the Holy Spirit's guidance rather than your own anxious planning. When you face a decision, instead of immediately analyzing all possible outcomes, you can learn to pause and ask, Holy Spirit, what is your wisdom in this situation? When you encounter obstacles, instead of immediately searching for human solutions, you can inquire, what strength do you want to give me? This isn't about becoming passive, it's about becoming responsive to divine initiative rather than driven by human fear. Perhaps you've heard about divine providence, but have you ever witnessed it personally, unmistakably, in a way that left no doubt God was orchestrating circumstances beyond your control? Saint Teresa lived so immersed in this reality that her life became a continuous testimony of how God provides exactly what's needed, exactly when it's needed, for those who trust completely in His care. Her experience reveals a truth that could revolutionize how you view every challenge you face. Teresa founded 17 monasteries during her lifetime, often without any human resources to sustain them. She would arrive in a new city with perhaps a few coins and the absolute certainty that God would provide everything necessary. And He did. Time and again, benefactors appeared when they were most needed. Solutions emerged from unexpected sources. Obstacles dissolved in ways that defied human explanation. But Teresa understood something crucial. Providence doesn't operate according to human timing or methods. It operates according to divine wisdom. The Catholic Church teaches that God's providence extends to every detail of creation. CCC 302-314. Nothing escapes His loving care, not even the smallest concerns of your daily life. But Teresa discovered that experiencing this providence requires what she called holy abandonment, the willingness to trust God's methods even when they don't match your preferences. God's ways, she often reminded her nuns, are not our ways, and His thoughts are not our thoughts, but His ways are always better. This doesn't mean becoming irresponsible or passive. Teresa was one of the most active and practical people of her era, but she learned to distinguish between human effort guided by divine wisdom and human effort driven by anxiety and the need for control. When you operate from trust rather than fear, your actions become more effective because they're aligned with divine purpose rather than opposed to it. Can you begin to see your current challenges not as problems to solve, but as opportunities to witness divine providence in action? Right now, as you read these words, there's probably a voice in your head cataloging everything you need to manage, control, or fix in your life. This voice feels responsible, mature, even virtuous. But Saint Teresa identified this as one of the subtlest temptations the soul faces, the temptation to believe that your security depends on your ability to control outcomes rather than on God's faithful love. This temptation becomes stronger, not weaker, as you grow in spiritual maturity. Teresa experienced this temptation intensely during her work of reform. The more monasteries she founded, the more she felt responsible for their success. The more people trusted her guidance, the more she felt pressured to have all the answers. But she learned to recognize this pressure as a spiritual trap, the enemy's way of getting her to rely on her own wisdom rather than on divine guidance. When I try to be providence for others, she wrote, I cease to trust in providence for myself. The Church warns against the sin of presumption, assuming we can achieve spiritual goals through our own efforts without divine grace. CCC 2091-2092. But Teresa discovered an even subtler danger, the temptation to help God by taking control of situations He wants to handle Himself. This isn't obviously sinful. It often appears generous and responsible, but it reveals a lack of trust in God's competence to manage His own creation. Breaking free from this temptation requires what Teresa called holy indifference, the willingness to care deeply about outcomes while simultaneously being willing to accept whatever God permits. This seems contradictory, but it's actually the essence of mature faith. You can work diligently for good outcomes while holding those outcomes with open hands, trusting that God's will is ultimately better than your own plans. This paradox, caring without controlling, might be exactly what your soul needs to learn right now. Have you ever watched a master craftsman work with a difficult material? The material that yields to the craftsman's hands becomes a work of art, while the material that resists remains rough and unformed. Saint Teresa discovered that the soul's relationship with the Holy Spirit follows this same principle. Docility, the willingness to be shaped by divine hands, isn't weakness. It's the prerequisite for becoming the masterpiece God envisions you to be. Teresa learned this lesson through years of trying to direct her own spiritual development. She would set goals for her prayer life, establish rules for her spiritual exercises, measure her progress according to her own standards. But she found that the more she tried to control her spiritual growth, the more mechanical and lifeless it became. Everything changed when she learned what she called docilidad santa, holy docility, the art of yielding to the Holy Spirit's guidance even when it didn't match her expectations. The Church teaches that docility to the Holy Spirit is essential for spiritual growth. CCC 2672. But this isn't about becoming passive or losing your personality. It's about aligning your natural gifts and tendencies with divine purpose. Teresa discovered that when she stopped fighting the Holy Spirit's guidance, her true personality emerged more clearly than ever. Surrender didn't diminish her. It revealed who she really was beneath layers of fear and self-protection. This transformation happens gradually, through small acts of yielding in daily life. When you feel the urge to control a conversation, you can pause and ask the Holy Spirit to guide your words. When anxiety arises about the future, you can practice returning your concerns to God's care. When pride tempts you to defend yourself, you can choose humility instead. Each act of docility creates more space for divine action in your life. Teresa promised that souls who practice this yielding consistently will experience a peace and effectiveness that surpasses human understanding. How do you know when the Holy Spirit is taking control of your life? Saint Teresa, through decades of intimate experience with divine action, identified unmistakable signs that the Spirit is working in a soul. These signs might already be appearing in your life, but perhaps you haven't recognized them yet. Learning to identify them will strengthen your faith and encourage you to surrender even more completely to divine guidance. The first sign Teresa identified is unexplainable peace in circumstances that should cause anxiety. When you find yourself calm in the midst of chaos, when you experience serenity despite uncertain outcomes, when your heart remains steady while everything around you shifts. This is the Holy Spirit establishing His peace in your soul. This isn't natural human composure. It's supernatural tranquility that comes only from divine presence. The second sign is the appearance of solutions you never could have imagined. Teresa consistently experienced this in her work of reform. Just when situations seemed impossible, unexpected help would arrive, doors would open, hearts would change. But she learned to recognize that these solutions often came in ways that defied human logic or expectation. The Holy Spirit delights in demonstrating that His ways are higher than our ways, that His wisdom surpasses human understanding. The third sign is the multiplication of your efforts beyond their natural capacity. When you surrender your work to divine guidance, you often accomplish far more than your abilities would suggest possible. Teresa founded 17 monasteries and wrote multiple books that continue to guide souls centuries later. Yet she was often ill and faced constant opposition. The Holy Spirit has a way of multiplying surrendered efforts, creating impact that extends far beyond what you could achieve through human striving alone. Are you beginning to recognize these signs in your own life? Tonight, as you prepare to close this reflection, imagine what your life would look like if you truly believed that God's love for you is more reliable than your ability to control your circumstances. Saint Teresa lived from this reality so completely that even her struggles became opportunities for deeper trust. Her failures became doorways to greater grace. Her uncertainties became invitations to experience divine faithfulness. This is the abundant life Jesus promised, not a life without challenges, but a life lived in unshakable confidence in divine love. Teresa's final years were marked not by the absence of difficulties, but by a profound peace that remained constant regardless of external circumstances. She faced opposition from religious authorities, physical pain from chronic illness, and the heartbreak of seeing some of her reforms threatened. Yet her letters from this period radiate joy, gratitude, and absolute trust in God's goodness. She had learned the secret of living simultaneously in human limitation and divine abundance. The Church teaches that this trust is not just a personal blessing, but a gift meant to be shared. CCC 2044-2046. When you live from deep confidence in God's providence, you become a source of peace for others who are still trapped in fear and the need for control. Your trust becomes contagious. Your peace becomes healing. Your surrender becomes an invitation for others to discover the same freedom. This is how divine love spreads through the world, through ordinary people who have learned to live extraordinary trust. As you close this time of reflection, Teresa offers you one final invitation. Let nothing trouble you. Let nothing frighten you. All things pass away. God never changes. Whoever has God lacks nothing. God alone suffices. These aren't just beautiful words. They're a way of life, a choice you can make every moment of every day. The Holy Spirit is waiting to take control of your life, not to diminish you, but to reveal the masterpiece He has always seen in you. The only question remaining is, are you ready to let Him? Write in the comments, Saint Teresa, teach me to trust more than to ask for things. If this message touched your heart, subscribe to our channel. Here we continue to bring light from the writings, tears, and silent victories of the great saints. You are already part